All right, so let's do a review of where we are in the argument, especially since for our friends who missed the last half of the section on the virtues. So we've been working on the problem of the myth of the ring of Gyges. The challenge is, why bother being good if you could get away with being bad? The entire book is an attempt to answer that question. It was pushed for us hard through the myth, the challenge of the myth of the ring. If you could be completely invisible and act with impunity, how would you behave? And so that put a great challenge on us. And then we used the example of the bank. Would we take the money if we could get away with it? And we were like, we had a bit of a split classroom on that question, which is perfectly normal, by the way, perfectly normal. And Socrates said justice is good in itself. What the myth did, the challenge, is it isolated the value of justice as something good in itself. Meaning, maybe we only really want justice for what it can get us and for the harms it can avoid if we act justly. But if we could get away with murder, well, maybe we should do that. So Socrates said, no, justice is good in itself, even if all the heaping harms of misery that typically attend the unjust man are put on the just man, and even if all the rewards of justice are put on the unjust man. Totally flipping appearance and reality, which is what the challenge of the myth is designed to do. Socrates told us a couple of weeks ago that we're going to have to isolate the true nature of justice. Glaucon and Automatus is like, please bring it on. This is what we really want. Because as Socrates said, if I really thought you believed what you're preaching, right, I wouldn't trust you, but I do, and I know your characters. And they're like, that's right. We want this not to be true, Socrates, but we can't figure it out. So we're presenting the argument to you, and Socrates is like, okay, but you're going to have to join in, right? And they joined in, and the argument launched. What argument? Well, justice is difficult to identify, and the soul seems murky and hard to identify too. So why not look for justice in a bigger place rather, namely in a city? And so if we can identify the nature of justice and injustice and its rising and its falling apart in cities, then perhaps if the city is similar to the soul, then we can find its nature in the soul. And so we spent an entire class city building in thought, because of course, not being philosophers rather than engineers, we don't dare build real cities for our experiment. Plus, whenever I've sought funding from universities to actually put this into effect and build a city, I'm always turned down. Weirdest thing, Yeah. It's outrageous. Maybe Father Vince would be different. No, he wouldn't. Okay, moving on. Next topic.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the premise of this discussion, or what we're trying to do, is understand the human individual based on this theoretical city that we're building.
Correct.
Except that Socrates has told us that we're building a feverish city.
Correct.
So,
but as he said, justice and injustice will still be found. We can find probably the origin of justice and injustice there too, so it doesn't harm our inquiry. But it doesn't mean that the Republic is actually the ideal best city.
So are we building then, by extension, the ideal best soul, or are we just getting
well, we will see
body politic? We're getting the big...
Is the human condition necessarily feverish?
Well, it depends what you mean by the human condition. The question is, what's the state of any particular given soul? What's the state of any given particular city? Today we will talk about the virtues in the soul once we make the analogy. But then, we're not done, because then we have to look at the larger question of cities and souls that are like them, and that's where we'll get into Book 8 for next class. And then we'll start the big picture, and that will help deal with some of this bigger question. Well, how do we talk about cities and souls that start to degrade? And what do we make of that? And that will be absolutely mind-blowing in Book 8. So I don't want to fully give this away. Let's get into the argument. But it's a great question, but let's put some of that off to later. In the meantime, we got to finish the argument for where justice is in the soul, because last week we identified the virtues in our city. And we saw that there's 4 virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. And in each case, we ask the question, what is the nature of this particular virtue? And where is it located in our city? In other words, is it located in our ruling guardians, the true guardians as Socrates calls them, in our warriors, our guardian auxiliary class, or in our producers? And we started with wisdom, and we said, well, what is wisdom? And I had you break up into groups, and you carved out each one of these. You guys picked the right name. They were minors. They all had the hard hat on, carving into the text to try to figure out what the nature of each virtue was. Wisdom we found to be good counsel concerning the good of the whole of the city, not merely a part. crucial condition, which we're going to see by the end of this class, is very important. All right. And then courage. Courage was a very complicated definition. Courage turns out to be adherence to what is true, lawful, and good opinion concerning things that are terrible. Get back to that for you too. Concerning these things that are terrible, over against the threats of fear, which of course we all understand courage to be, but also against the bribes or promises of pleasure. In other words, you can steer away from the good to the left or to the right. To the right, you can be scared and run away. But to the left, maybe you'll embrace pleasures and the promises of rewards from your friends and social, whatever. And so the true courageous man, the true courageous woman is the person that sticks to the good no matter what. And thus, there's a form of courage that is the warrior kind, the bravery on the battlefield, of overcoming fear. But there's also the other kind that stands up against hedonistic, pleasurable advances in your career or whatever and says, no, I got to just stay to the true and the good. But what's this thing about things that are terrible? Well, we saw that terror is not evil in itself. We think this way as Americans because of 9/11 and because the whole terrorism issue. But there's a sense in which God is called terrible in the Psalms. And we saw last week that that terribleness is the terribleness of power rightly connected to justice. A terror we recognize, we feel when we're in the grocery store line when a police officer's there. And what do we know? Fixate on his gun, right? We feel the gun makes us terrified. Right then you're like, I'm not going to steal the gum. I'm not going to steal the gum. I'm not going to steal the gum, right? You keep, I'm not going to do it, right? Because the gun reminds you of the power and authority of law, right? What's a Roman law without a Roman legion? But when you put a legion behind that law, it's terrifying. And look at the armament that our governing agents have, right? It's unbelievable. All the police are armed to the teeth. FBI is armed to the teeth, right? National Guard, and look at the military. Wow, this is impressive arsenal. And so we think to ourselves, should we obey laws? Yes, it's a good plan, obey the laws. Because you feel terror if you're a law breaker. And that's part of the point. That's what the Guardian Auxiliaries do. They help inspire us toward being obedient to law, both through the promise of good things, but also through the threat if we should veer away from the true and the good. But then again, we also have the virtue of, and of course that virtue is found where? Courage?
Auxiliaries.
Our guardian auxiliaries. And of course the virtue of wisdom would obviously be found where? Our true guardians, our rulers. Virtue of moderation. And we thought this was very weird, right? Very weird. How can a man be stronger than himself? We thought that's odd. How can you be stronger than yourself? And so it must be that there must be a part of yourself that's not quite as strong, or it's a little bit weaker than the other parts. And the better, higher quality man, the person who's moderated, has the better part of himself ruling the weaker part. You're out of control if the weaker part is ruling the better part. So moderation is that virtue in the city where everyone recognizes right rule. Hence the producers need to recognize the importance of the lawgivers and follow the laws. Hence the producers must have the virtue of moderation. But then so must the guardian auxiliaries. We can't have our soldiers committing coups against the regime, right? So it turns out that the virtue of moderation is also applicable to our guardian auxiliaries. But then it even turned out that the virtue of moderation has to apply to our rulers. They have to do the job of actually ruling, which is not fun. True ruling power, all power is given for the sake of those under it. And this means that true political power is that power in which you get invested in other people's problems with no benefit to yourself. That's what political power really is. And you do the job. Who would want that? Makes you wonder whether anyone you know that has political power is actually using true political power, right? Because it's a thankless job. So, our rulers need the virtue of moderation to place themselves under the laws that they put on everyone else and to actually do the job of forming the laws rather than fishing it out to their aides or everybody else. All right, so that's crucial. And then, did we not find out the nature of justice? And Socrates says, strangely enough, it's been rolling around on our feet the whole time. And it turned out to be what principle?
Their allotted role.
Everyone sticking to their allotted role. The principle of one man, one job that we had at the beginning. What is it that causes all the problems and injustice in a city?
Plato would put into
Nature.
doing what you are.
Yes, that's correct. Allotted, not so good. Natural, yes. Because we're differently gifted. Good correction. So, each person fulfilling the role that is according to his best lights, his best skills. But really, as we talked about, we used you two, the apples and the wood bearers, last week, even though you weren't here. And we said, if they have a conflict, is this going to bring the city down? Not so likely. We'll all be like, here they go again. Why can't they get along, right? No, the real conflict comes when you have interclass conflict, right? The producers try to do the job of the guardians. Tell them all warrior decisions will be made according to the committee of the oligarchs. How will this meet the bottom line, right? And whoever's got the apple growers got the bottom line, suddenly the army's heading out to kill anybody who grows apples from other cities, right? No doubt. She's like, yeah, that's right. Yeah, apple grower. Right? So this is not good for the city as a whole, according to nature, right? Or what if the warriors decide to take over and start ruling, right? Then we're suddenly under the worst form of martial law or coup. Or what if the rulers decide to leave the impartial status that they have and start investing in particular producing class jobs, right? Like all of a sudden they buy into lumber. And she's like, well, I have a problem with the lumber people. I want to take it to the court. Only, I'm sorry, the judge has a 40% stake in the lumber. She's like, oh, I can't wait to get to court. And the apple grower's like, I don't think I'm going to get a fair hearing, right? So we think, and you can see how we deal with this in our own day and age, right? 2,600 years later, 2,400 years later, we say things like the judge must recuse himself if he has, a connection. So these ancient principles are very much alive and well. And when we find cases where they don't seem to be working, we get concerned because we think this is a crucial principle. So here's what Socrates is really up to. He is not looking for a negative account of justice. Is how we think of it. We think of justice criminally. Like, right, the bad guy did a wrong thing and he gets put in prison. Socrates is, of course, interested in that. But he's interested in the positive form of justice. What is that quality that a city has and then in a soul that when possessed will eliminate those types of problems? So if each class minds its own business and does its own job, right, then we will not have that sort of interclass warfare and the city will have a harmony. He likens it to the three, although you'd probably insist it's four notes. We have a true musician here. 4 notes, right, on the scale, and it creates a harmony of the whole, which each group does its thing. Stop being a busybody and sticking your nose in everyone else's business. That's the principle. Okay? Now, that we realized was phase 1. Finally, we have an account of justice. Then we said we need to now prove that the city is like the soul, phase 2. Then if the city is like the soul, we can go to phase 3 and identify the 4 virtues in the city. And then once we've done that, we'll have, in the soul rather. And then once we have justice in the soul, we'll solve the myth of the ring of Gyges. Tonight the mission is to do phases 2, 3, and 4. So, back to the book. Let's open and see what we can find in there. What a wonderful book. So we left off trying to figure out, is justice in the soul like the city? And to prove that, we have to show that the city and the soul are in fact similar. So, how would we prove that there's a structural similarity? You say, well, what is the structure we're after? Okay, good question. So we saw that our city had 3 elements, the rulers, which was how big? How big would you say the rulers were in the city? Biggest class, medium-sized class, or the smallest? Yeah, smallest. Next were our guardian auxiliaries. And what would you think about their size?
Big if it's still small.
So medium. And then, of course, our producing classes, our wealth creators. Largest, yeah? So the question is, do we have these 3 elements within our soul? Now, you might say, well, how would we find out? And how would we know that whatever we think we're finding in the soul is not the same thing misnamed, right? Like the evening star and the morning star, 2 names for the same thing, the planet Venus. We don't want to do that, right? We get confused. Well, the way you know 2 things are different, according to the ancient principles of logic, is to find a conflict between them. Then they can't be the same. So, for example, if you had to distinguish a basketball from an ice cream cone, what would you notice about the 2 that would make them clearly not the same thing? Lacking shape. Problematic. Cone versus circle. Not geometrically compatible.
Takes a lot more heat to melt one.
It takes a lot more heat to melt the one, right? One bounces, the other goes splat. One tastes delicious, the other very rubbery. Not good, right? So you begin to realize, you look at the properties of each object, where they conflict, you know they cannot be the same object. We call this the principle of difference. So here's the question. Can you find within your souls a principle of conflict? Anyone experience any conflict in their soul ever? And if so, what would it be about?
Any number of things.
Really? Like what?
Think about eating.
Eating?
Forgiveness versus revenge, indulgence versus.
I mean, if you were Catholics, I think you were talking about ethics. Oh, wait a minute. You are all Catholics. Yeah. Anybody who has any ethical bone in their body, which of course as Catholics we all do, right, is very aware of this problem. I desire to do X. Reason says, yeah, maybe not the best thing. Conflict, right? We experience this all the time. So clearly, there is a part, let's call it reason, that thinks about the good of the whole, right? And there's a part, let's call it desire, or maybe someone shut it because they're busy. I don't know what's going on.
Dark place, very quickly.
Yes.
Check the exits, everyone.
Desire, right, which says, oh, I would like to have more chocolate cake. Speaking of food, right? Or I would like to get revenge upon that person for what he did to me, right? And if you think about it, structurally, do you notice certain isomorphisms with the city? How loud in your soul is reason? Very, very quiet, right? What do you realize? You're aware of what's the right thing to do. That's it. No force whatsoever. Pathetically weak. Very small. Right? Check mark, yeah?
You mean like compared to the appetites of the...
Desire, appetite, right? The ancients call this appetite. We should use that term, but of course keep in mind, this is more than food. All desire. How strong is this in you? Very, very loud, right? Just like the producing classes, check mark. So for sure, we have these two parts. They often oppose one another. So clearly we've got two parts. This is easy. It's the third part that's the problem. How in the world would we establish a third part and guarantee that it's not one of the others repeated? Well, simple, right? We have to apply the principle of difference twice. We need something in the soul that could oppose both reason and desire or appetite. So, is there anything in your soul that has that kind of experience, that kind of function, that would then map onto whatever's going on over here with our guardian auxiliaries?
The will.
Okay, but we have to talk about the will. What exactly do we mean by that? Because the faculty of choice itself, we could argue, is built into reason. To be a rational agent, remember, is to operate according to reasons, not causes, which mean you're just not a thing being led along. You look at the options and you decide according to what you perceive as being the best. That's a choice. So let's think about this further. Something in you that has the capacity to sort of war against and rein in desire with force. I mean, military force.
What happens? Can it side with desire, or is it by...
It could side with desire against reason. It could side with reason against desire. If it's a third thing, it has to be able to do both. I'm thinking of people that are in fourth quarter of a game. Basketball game or a soccer game, they both have quarters, right? I played basketball. I think soccer has 4 quarters. Maybe. Nobody knows? Excellent.
It has quarters,
Three,
but
I know
four.
that.
It has to have 3. It has to have 4 if they're quarters. Otherwise, it's thirds.
Soccer has 2 periods.
Oh, it's just 2 periods? For our friends at home, we're imagining a soccer game that has 4 quarters. Anyway, so basketball, we'll go with basketball. You know the situation, right? You're playing the game, you're down 8 to 12 points. The coach is there, boy, you know, you're going to have to do something. And the coach gives you a speech, right? And you could have had this on the baseball team, you could have had this in the football team, you could have had this in the volleyball team, softball team, soccer team, okay? And you know what I'm talking about? The coach somehow rallies you. Your legs say, I'm tired, I don't want to run anymore, especially in soccer, right? Exhausted. Your body is so worn out. You're feeling deflated because the other team just keeps scoring. And it's so aggravating. And yet somehow your coach gives you a speech, not unlike what we talked about with the speeches for the Guardian Auxiliaries. Remember? The speech that colonel, that Marine colonel gave me at West Point that made us all want to immediately go out and bayonet something and we couldn't understand why? Right? Or Henry V, the famous St. Crispin's Day speech that made any one of us who wasn't there to slaughter the French on that day feel like we missed out. And how do they do that? Right? Or Thomas Paine. Remember, the summer soldier runs away. And you're like, well, I'm not a summer soldier. I can handle eating more shoe leather at Valley Forge. Right? Speeches that rally the soul and move us to sticking it out. Now, whatever's going on there is opposed to desire. It can rally you against desire. Even if you don't have a coach, what if you're a 5K or a marathon runner? Right? You know, at the end, you runners, oh, it hurts. Right? And every system says, just stop. Look, you can join the crowd. Just rip off your tag and blend in. No one's going to notice. Your legs are like, yep, we're in. Let's take a vote. Arms in, heart, definitely. Lungs, please let us stop. And you're like, no, we're not stopping. You are going to keep moving, one leg in front of the other, and I don't care, I don't want to hear it. But we're in pain, right? And then out comes the little sayings. Pain is just weakness leaving the body, give me a break. You will press on, right? What is this thing? And it's interesting that we keep finding it in athletic examples. Because athletes seem to have this thing. Interestingly, so do warriors. Right? Remember some of these special forces mottos? You're never out of the fight. Doesn't matter how beaten up, how shot you are, as long as you're still breathing, you can pull the trigger. So you win the fight first, then we worry about your wounds. What kind of mindset is capable of that? It's a mindset that says, I will not allow desire to dictate terms to me. I tell my desires what's going to happen here. I'll take their input, but sometimes there are bigger goals than what I want. And I'm just going to have to buckle under. That's interesting. It's something that maybe we should call it a spirited part. Now, don't think of this religiously. Spirited like team spirit. Spirit like Spirit Week in high school. You know what I'm talking about? Spirit like the military HUA principle. That's what we're talking about. That thing that galvanizes you and rallies you and says you have gold in the soul, right? And you're going to finish this task. You're going to finish the mission. Mission first, no matter what. That is possible, and that power definitely can reign in desire. We've seen it over and over and over again. But maybe that's just reason. Can this thing be turned on reason? If so, we've identified our third part. Give me an example of when this imaginative, enthusiastic power goes the other direction and overwhelms reason. What would be an example?
Well, reason is concerned with the protection of the whole, right? And you're in a battle. There's, I'm sure, times when it's better to run away and tend to your wounds, but it's kind of the thing bigger than the whole.
Right.
Maybe.
I mean, we know about these cases, right? The guy that jumps out of the foxhole. They got Johnny. I'm going to get him. Ah! He charges in the battle. You're like, where you going? Get back here. Hide in the foxhole, man. Watch the war. He's like, where'd he go? I don't know, Sarge. He's just gone. And, 3 hours later, he comes back with 150 prisoners. You're like, this did happen, by the way, World War I. You're like, how'd you do that? What? I don't know. No idea. Elisa used the term berserker. This comes from a Viking thing where they took drugs and went crazy. But the trouble is, sometimes in war, people get so enraged, reason is totally overwhelmed. Now, sometimes this leads to great, seemingly heroic actions, like capturing 150 prisoners. Other times, it leads to warriors slaughtering everyone in an entire town. And afterward, they barely remember this happened. The point is,
For one example, and Millet on the other side.
In me lie, yes, that's correct, right? And that's your concern. Surely reason has to be able to govern these passions. And that's the point. We now have a part that could go against reason. And in moral life, we have a term for this. It's called a bad temper, right? If this thing's out of control, this is the guy who's angry all the time, and none of us want to be around when he blows, right? Men, pay attention to this. Very often, we're the ones that can have these problems, and we must not allow ourselves to get mad and act with force against our wives or children. Future wives or wives, pay attention to this. If your husbands have an issue with this, think constitutionally, what's going on? How can we sort of deal with this problem? Because this can be a tremendous ally to reason. And force rightly used is a ferocious tiger. But if that tiger aims itself at friends and family, we have a problem. And that sounds familiar. Wasn't this exactly what we were concerned about when we were developing our guardians? So what would Socrates say? What would Socrates say we ought to do if our spirited part is out of control or too weak? Because I'll bet some of you have had this problem. You're aware of what you should do. And you say, I'm going to do that. And then you find yourself doing the opposite. And then you're like, that wasn't good. Go to confession, try to deal with it. And you say, now I really know what I'm going to do. And then you find yourself doing the opposite. You're like, why does this keep happening? Ask yourself, what would be the Socratic analysis? What's missing in your life? Yes, but the training that gets you there. Many Americans, especially because of our penchant toward hedonism, the view that happiness is pleasure, big mistake, right, are pleasure addicts. Pleasure addicts. My male students, college students, they're all addicted to porn and video games. This does not make for great men. This makes for addicts. And what they don't have is any kind of serious spirited part. And my female students are like, why are they all boys, not men? Well, that's the problem. So what would Socrates say we ought to do to develop a powerful spirited part in our souls?
Train yourself philosophically.
Okay, first, that's actually third. Philosophy. Yeah, but philosophy is very much for reason. And as we've just seen, reason is not sufficient here. Remember, the ethical life is not just reason over body. It's not mind over body. The ethical life is the whole of your human person, body and soul together. If you think you can just will it out over your body, you've already made the fundamental Gnostic error of thinking that you are just a soul trapped in a body. You're not a soul trapped in a body, you are a mind-body composite. So you must use both systems all the time. But of course, that's exactly what Socrates told us was the key to the education of the guardians. We're always hitting both body and soul with the training, yes? So what was the first element of guardian auxiliary training? That was the second, but we'll go with it. Music. First one was? Athletics, gymnastics. First principle, if you're struggling with desire, start to get an exercise program. Because an exercise program immediately puts you in a position of having to discipline your body. And as soon as you start disciplining your body, you know what starts to happen? It bleeds into your moral life, and you find yourself suddenly able to discipline your sexual desire. You start to deal with your avarice. You start to deal with your acquisitiveness, all these different things. You're like, it works like that? Yes. Yes, it does. Self-control of the body affects the soul. Why do we Catholics fast? Think about it. It's the same thing. It's military training, right? It's military training. When you're fasting, you are training yourself to say, okay, I'm going to eat less food, and I'm in charge here, body. You're going to work with the system. And then later in life, when you're not fasting, when you hit a temptation, that's one of your vulnerabilities, you're going to be like, I've been training myself. I don't have to give in to my desires. right? I've been doing physical exercise. I don't have to give in to my desires. My body has been trained. But that's not enough, right? Mere physicality is not enough because we also need to train the soul. And Socrates told us we needed to do what? Music, the arts, theater, great speeches. Those elements that we can grab onto and move ourselves. Here's the thing. Reason cannot move us very effectively. If I tell you, Ty, you should stop lying. He'd be like, yep, that's one of the commandments. Let's not lie. Right? But Ty, you know, someday you probably have a son and you want to teach your son not to lie. How are you going to do that? You can say, son, do not lie. Or you could tell him a story. Right? Remember the famous story of George Washington and the cut cherry tree?
We were told Peter, or the boy who cried wolf.
Okay, that's another good one. And and then the bottom line is, do you want to be like the boy that cried wolf? No. Do you want to be like George Washington? Yes. Question, why do stories move us so much more profoundly than orders?
They provide an example, something to model real life after.
Yes. They provide us an actual incarnate example. Ready? Here we go. Mind and body merged. A moral command is nothing but a rule. It's pure mind. For angels, that'd be fine. We're not angels. We need something that moves our passions, that moves our enthusiastic system, that we want to emulate heroically. In a culture that does everything it can to tear down all of our moral heroes, understand that is the death knell of a civilization. We need heroes. So I used to tell my students 10 or 15 years ago, because this was an appropriate example then, you know, should we make Madonna a hero? And my smart students said, which Madonna? Nowadays, no one remembers the other Madonna, right? All we remember is the Blessed Virgin, thankfully. But is it the Material Girl? Right? If you have posters of the Material Girl all over your room, as a young woman, your father's probably going to be nervous. If you have pictures of the Blessed Virgin, he's going to be like, there's hope here. Right? So we have to think about, who do we put up as models for ourselves? Who are we trying to emulate? How do we use great speeches, heroic elements in the arts, great poems to move ourselves, and music too? You know, I used to tell my college freshmen, I said, look, if you're in the back seat of your car, the music is pumping, good luck not giving it up. With your boyfriend, obviously, okay? Good luck, right? Because all the music, everything is set up for a problem. Now, you can change the entire equation if you alter the music. Switch it to the Stars and Stripes Forever. And all of a sudden, unless he's a Marine, if he's a Marine, forget about it, you're doomed. But if he's not a Marine, you're like, oh, the mood just got blown. Correct. Music impacts us. Right? Did we talk about this? The people that lift the weights? Right? What kind of music is blaring there?
Yeah.
Right? It's not romantic music. It's serious heavy metal, because that's the music that's appropriate. So here's the point. Think about how music impacts you. And you're all different. You've got to be completely honest with yourself. You choose your music. Do not let your music choose you. And think about, how does this music move me? Is it going to be good for me? If not, change it. Right? If it's extremely romantic music and you just broke up with your boyfriend and this is going to put you into a bad way, put on something else. You're like, what could I possibly do? It's American music. Right. And that's part of our problem, right? Why don't we have music that does all kinds of things? Remember after 9/11 when we needed great heroic music and we had these pop stars put on their regular shows and we're like, I'm sorry, this just isn't working. Right? And then what they bring out? Toby Keith, remember? The music's about the Taliban and everything, and everyone like, yeah, let's get them, baby. Right? Because that galvanized us to a courageous action. So choose the music that's going to move you toward the good, and be honest about it, and understand that it's going to be different for different people. Here's the point. Use the arts. The arts are phenomenal if you try to use them in your moral life. And if you couple physical discipline and the order of team spirit together with the right kind of music, and you couple that to philosophical understanding of why the ethical good is the good, and you put that into practice, you know what you're going to start to do? You're going to start to develop a phalanx in your soul. And then when your desires start telling you what's what, you're going to be telling your desires, oh, I don't think so. Because now reason, the king, has an army. You do not have to be defeated by desire. We are not like Protestants who perpetually seek brokenness, singing about it perpetually. Stage 2 of the spiritual growth, according to St. John, is that you are a young man and you are strong in the Word of God and you have defeated the evil one. That means you've broken the power of sin in your life. You should not be constantly broken by your sins. It's time to grow up, get strong, become better.
What do you mean, Protestants? What do they do?
Well,
They love sad stories about the guy who just can't stop doing X, and he's always asking forgiveness, and he's always getting forgiven. It's always very emotional, and everyone cries and feels catharsis, and the same thing happens next week.
Well said.
Yeah.
yes, that's not supposed to be us. It doesn't mean you don't have vulnerabilities. You might say, I'm with here again, Father Evans. You might not remember who I am, but you remember the sin. Okay? I understand that every one of you has a different set of vulnerabilities. You have a set of strengths, you have a set of vulnerabilities. And these vulnerabilities take time to habituate out of vices into virtues. But you cannot do it with willpower alone. You have to understand this. You have to train the whole human system. And if you do that, you will find an amazing thing. Socrates is doing something genius here. And we Catholics, especially because of our understanding of the links to the body and the soul, should understand this. We don't have a word for this in English, but the best maybe is something like the imagination, which properly fueled gives you an amazing power, especially, now we'll just directly invoke our faith here, when it's infused with the theological virtue of hope and the unbelievable promises and destiny that God has for us as human beings. No matter how down you are, when you remember what God has in store for us, that can lift your spirits and cause you to say, I am not giving up. I am never out of the fight until I'm dead, and I'm not dead. So I'm not giving up. It's extremely crucial to hold with that kind of perseverance and endurance. But that comes through discipline.
And it seems like too, isn't that really what evokes like the best parts of stories for us? You know, Lord of the Rings. Right?
Yeah.
You take that, it's like, okay, well, it's the unbrokenness of this little hobbit creature. Wow, humanity is fighting this war, but they don't have nothing on with. They have no clue reason, right? But it's still
Right, and that's why the Lord of the Rings is so unbelievably inspiring. Right, and when you watch Sam, he's thrown to the side, Gollum has tricked Frodo, right? And he's giving up, and then he suddenly realizes, he sees the breadcrumbs, I'm not giving up. And he charges right back up that mountain, and in the end, Samwise Gamgee is the one who saves the day, because Frodo caves. Friendship, I mean, look at what this story is about. So, yes, those stories are the things that inspire us. And that's why we could be thankful that Hollywood put on such a fantastic rendition of Lord of the Rings. But we need to be reading great literature and inspiring one another with great stories and moving ourselves through the arts to become much better people.
You mentioned that could also be a bad part, or
Yes.
So is it the lack of the spirited part, or is it the corruption of the?
It's the corruption of the spirited part. Like, do you remember when was it Dennis Rodman, the basketball player, who was so angry he ran out of the court and started kicking some cameraman or something? Or was it Mike Tyson, not baseball, what's it called? In a boxing match, he bit his ear. You're like, wait, that's not what's supposed to happen. No. So athletes often don't have the other part, and they get out of control. And that's why we're nervous about athletes sometimes. But soldiers out of control are way worse.
When you say the other part, would that be the music part, or?
Yeah, the learning, the musical.
Okay.
The philosophical is a deep understanding of what the good is and why it is good for us. See, a lot of people, especially in the United States, are under the impression that goodness is boring and miserable, and evil is fun. Okay, and the truth is the exact opposite. Goodness illuminates the world and gives us an infinite set of possibility, because goodness is substantive, evil is privational. It's the lack of things. And it all gets twisted in people's minds. And they think, well, I want to pursue evil, but you can't possibly be happy with that. And once you really understand what goodness is and why it's so fantastic, then your brain is in the right position. If you don't understand that, it's hard to even want to pursue to reign in desire.
So if you were to look at like an example of, say like Nazi Germany, or where
Yeah.
you see the stirring speeches, you have that that poetry, you have like the
Yep.
fatherland motif
Yep.
and the spirit in the music.
Yep.
But obviously it was bad, right?
Right, all put to the wrong ends.
So that would be then just lacking the philosophical understanding of what is actually good.
Yeah.
Would have the athletic.
That's absolutely right. Remember the definition of courage, because he mentioned the courageous. True, lawful, and good opinion. Where does that opinion come from? The rulers from reason.
Okay.
So this power can be tremendously abused by evil person. Every cult leader plays this to the hilt,
Yeah.
right? And we have to distinguish a cult from authentic faith. A political regime devoted to bad ends and using propagandistic efforts through speech and Orwellian tricks from true political power. But it's not wrong to use spirited elements when it's attached to goodness and truth. Then it's great. And for our kids, it's perfectly fine to try to merge all this.
I mean, we want our kids to be the one that stands up to the bully, right?
Yeah. Or if he doesn't have the strength, to figure out a way to get the bully through other means. But that's your point about, okay, I can't win this battle, but I'm going to gather, right? Even one of the things I remember Julia was telling me when she was a little girl, there were these kids who were being bullied by these other girls. And the question I had is, well, why don't all you girls band together? Form a republic, right? And I remember she was like, yeah. But most kids don't think like this. They think they're all alone. But imagine if all the kids said, we're not tolerating this anymore. And because the bullies, there's always a few of them, right?
That dovetails with practice much we have. So like gymnastics and philosophy, well, less than philosophy, are pretty straightforward. But how do you know if you're consuming music that is edifying to the soul?
What question is, what does it do to you?
Or aesthetically, generally? Aesthetically.
The question is, what does it do to you? What does it make you desire? And if you're not sure, ask your wife. How are you after you go to, your favorite television programs, your favorite plays, your favorite films you do? Do these things ultimately make you a better man or not? Help draw you to those ends. And if she says, I think you could use some improvement, women often have a real insight into the power of the arts. And they're always going to move you in the direction of Jane Austen. You're going to be like, oh, please. But I have to say, they're right about this one. More men need to read Jane Austen. My male students hate that, but it's true. It's not just Jane Austen. The women could benefit from Henry V, too. Yeah. All right. So we understand 3 parts of the soul, 3 parts of the city. Parallelism is established, yes? Phase 3. Let's get into it now. All right.
I have a question.
Yeah, fire away.
What is the word? You said there's not really a good word in English. I was just curious, what word is it that Plato uses?
Thumos, yeah.
Thumos?
Yeah. Doesn't have a direct translation. Hence, spirited part.
Sure.
But I do think it's very similar. But see, when you use the word imagination, people think Disney,
Yeah, sure.
right? Or they think something that, like in geometry, conjures up images. The better part is the poetic imagination. But the poetic imagination isn't enough, because the poetic imagination is witty and clever and inspires, but it isn't the same thing as the passions. And what Plato has in mind is something that merges all that. It's what happens when a great rhetorician or poet moves you, like the bayoneting example I gave earlier, or that St. Crispin's Day speech.
That movie, that gave us the music, right? It was about the marathoners, right?
Oh yeah,
Very
Chariots of
inspiring.
Fires.
Yes.
Yeah, Chariots of Fire, yeah.
It has the music and the image and
Right, all the elements together. Yeah, or the Gravity movie, where Sandra Bullock's stuck in space, and they have this unbelievable soundtrack, and she is going to get home no matter what, and she just keeps going and going.
hallucination, which helps her.
Hey, if he helps you out in a hallucination, go for it, right? All right, now where were we? Just man, that's good. Meddling, that's good. Where is my account of these virtues? Ooh, yes, the soul. All right, continuing on, we got that, we got that. Yep. Reason, desire. Yep, spirit, good. Ooh, let's go to 441C. Page 121, 441C. Well, I said, we've had a hard swim through that and pretty much agreed that the same classes that are in the city are in the soul of each one severally, and that their number is equal. Yes, that's so. Isn't it by now necessary that the private man be wise in the same way and because of the same thing as the city was wise? Of course. And further, that a city be courageous because of the same thing and in the same way as the private man is courageous? Of course. Same thing with justice. Of course. You're like, great, wait, what's the definition? right? Where's the definition? Well, I think if we turn the page, yes, 442C. Let's get those definitions. Then I suppose we call a single man courageous, 442C, page 122. 442C, then I suppose we call a single man courageous because of that part when his spirited part preserves through pains and pleasures what has been proclaimed by the speeches about that which is terrible and that which is not. So he has a powerful, passionate ally that connects to his understanding of what is good, and he merges them. Again, you can see how the theological virtue of hope functions in this way, to add a passionate power to what faith reveals, and thus move us through the promises of God to realize we are going to hold the line and not give up. Okay? We are benefited much more than our pagan ancestors because they do not have these theological virtues. But remember, the theological virtues work on what? The cardinal virtues. The theological virtues do not eliminate your humanity. They fulfill it. When God makes a saint, he does not unmake the man. So first and foremost, you must have courage in order for it then to be enhanced by the theological virtue of hope. So never split the two. Think the spiritual over here, the physical and the pagan is over here. Bzz, wrong. Everything that we have in the faith adds to all that was right from the pagans. And they were absolutely on track with this virtue. So, courage is holding fast to what is true, lawful, and good according to these speeches, according to what reason has given us, whether we are moved by pain, one side, or pleasure on the other side, we hold fast and we do not fail. Second, wisdom. Wise because of that little part which ruled in him and proclaimed these things, in its turn possesses within it the knowledge of that which is beneficial for each part and for the whole composed of the community of these three parts. Look, your reasoning capacity desperately needs wisdom. So courage is obviously here, wisdom is here. Right? You've got to understand the why of things. Why goodness is better than bad. Why beauty is greater than ugliness. Why reality is better than illusion. Especially in our country now where people are so befuddled about these things. And if you understand clearly what is what, then you can use that information to channel it through a properly disciplined and developed spirited part to rein in your desires and order them so that you can form an overall virtuous harmony as a human being. And then you become a soldier, right? You're simply not going to be knocked down. The devils are going to be like, well, we're not going to be able to get him. She's not going down. And then you start to replicate. Stage 3 of spiritual growth. St. John says spiritual parenting. People begin to emulate you. They begin to say, I like that person. I want to be like that person. And your gifts and your talents and your character traits, they begin to grow into other people. That's how the whole body of Christ's life is supposed to work. But the first thing we have got to do is defeat sin in our lives. And to do that, we need to have a reasoning part that really understands the value of goodness. And is not falling for tricks. Okay, not falling for tricks. Those of you who are new to the faith, we've got some newbies in here too. You just stick to the task of growing and learning. You say, well, would being in a Plato seminar be right? Yes. Moving on, moderation. And what about this? Isn't he moderate because of the friendship and accord of these parts, when the ruling part and the two ruled parts are of the single opinion that the calculating part ought to rule and don't raise faction against it? So, in the soul, what is moderation?
It's, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember like the formal definition. In my own words, it is cleaving to, like it's using reason to, I don't want to say like choose the middle path between vice and virtue,
There's no middle path between vice and virtue.
Yeah,
Virtue is the middle path.
Between the vices, both extremes are bad.
Correct.
But it's sort of successfully navigating that kind of moral map.
And who provides the moral map?
Well, in the city, it's the guardians.
And therefore in the soul?
It's our reason.
Reason, exactly. So each part of the soul must recognize right rule. That means your spirited part needs to pay attention to reason, who decides what's best in terms of those images that will help us become better people. And also, Our desires have to be trained to listen to what reason says. And sometimes that does require training that pushes things a little bit the other direction. And it is very interesting that we have the fasts, because the fasts do that. And they can seem really weird. But when you understand them in this light, all of a sudden, man, they make sense. We're not Stoics. Okay, do not misunderstand this. If you live perpetually in a fast, you're not being human. But if you live perpetually in a feast, you kind of forgot about the fact that that's the state in the kingdom of God when beatitude happens. So there's going to be times in your life when you're going to have plenty, and there's going to be times in your life you're not. And if you train yourself with the fast and with exercise and with all these elements, what you will be doing is preparing yourself. St. Paul once said, I have learned, whatever state I am, whether much or little, to be content. But that takes training and discipline and order. And you can train your desires. You'd be like, well, I really want another glass of wine. Okay, just say I'm not going to do that. Right? Now, there's lots of times that another glass of wine is going to be just fine. You've got to use your prudence here to figure this out. But training yourself so that your desires do not get to dictate terms to you. You dictate terms to your desires. And that you just have to be so honest. And if you be honest with yourself, you realize where your desires are winning and where other desires, they just have no place in your life, because that's not a vulnerability. If you're married, be frank with your spouse. Talk to your spouse, because there's nobody, especially males, there's nobody who knows you like your wife. But women, realize that your husbands might have insight into your life too. God gave us to each other and gave us the power to recognize errors in one another and to motivate us through the other gender toward the good. Great lesson from Pride and Prejudice, yes? Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet, both of them have both vices of Pride and Prejudice. Both of them are exposed through the gender powers of the other to be recognizing their vices and to want to do better. And that is the power in marriage, one of the great powers. Right? So newly married, I don't know what all of you other people are, where all your statuses are, but future marrieds, currently engaged, whatever, use the power of love to move you both gently and kindly with your spouse toward the good. All right, and finally, justice. Now, of course, a man will be just because of that which we are so often saying in the same way, quite necessarily. What about this? Has our justice in any way been blunted so as to seem to be something other than what it came to light as in the city? Not in my opinion, he said. I'm almost to E now. If there are still any doubts in our soul, we could reassure ourselves completely by testing our justice in light of the vulgar standards. Now, what are vulgar standards? We normally think of vulgarity as something negative. But that's not what Socrates has in mind here, right? What does he mean? Remember how we were saying that we normally think of justice in terms of it's not being unjust, right? And how Socrates is after the true positive account of justice, that form of justice which when present rules out all the injustices. Well, now the vulgar standards are the common standards, how normal people think of justice and injustice. So he says, let's use our account of justice and the man who has it, each part of his system doing its proper function and not trying to do the functions of the other parts. And let's see if this man would commit injustices. For example, if concerning this city and the man who by nature and training is like it, we were required to come to an agreement about whether, upon accepting a deposit of gold or silver, such a man would seem to be the one to filch it, do you suppose anyone would suppose that he would be the man to do it, and not rather those who were not such as he is? So if you brought $500 and you're like, here, Ben, please hold this $500 for me. I know you're a just man, you're full of virtue, and you know I trust you. 2 months later, you come back to Ben and ask for the money. Is Ben going to be like, money? What money? Would you be shocked? Yes, you would be. Right? Because a man possessing these qualities is reliable. He's moderate, he's just, he's wise, he's honest. He's not going to filch the money, right? Or again, what about temple robberies? Back then there weren't banks, so you put your money in the temple. Hence bank robberies. Remember how our story started with the bank? Yeah, note that. For temple robberies, thefts, betrayals, either of comrades in private or cities in public, wouldn't this man be beyond them? Right? If somebody betrays their country, like Benedict Arnold, you're like, yeah, I bet you he was lacking in virtue. Probably. Right? Yes, he would be beyond. Further, would he in any way be faithless in oaths or other agreements? Or is this a man of his word? Remember back in the day where we used to have this idea that if two men spit on their hands and handshaked, that was an act of God? And you wouldn't dare violate that agreement? Would our man be that sort? Yeah, you don't need contracts, right, and blood oaths. With this man, he gives you his word, it's going to happen. Of course, what about adultery? Is he going to cheat on his wife? Cheat on her husband? Not a chance, right? Think about how adultery would completely destroy and corrupt the family. And not just your own family, but your twin families that married. Marriage is not just a merger of two people, it's a merger of two families. Think about the way the damage spins out, right? How about neglected parents? Would this guy, the man of justice, moderation, wisdom, and courage, would he ignore the parents who had raised him? Failure to care for the gods. We have piety duties not just to family, to our parents, but also to the gods, right? For us, of course, it's God, but you get the idea. We're in paganism now. Right, of course, because we have oughts that we owe to the gods. They are owed their due. Okay, for us, of course, it's a thanksgiving and praise and Eucharistic love that we have for the Most High. And of every other kind, indeed, isn't the cause of all this. Okay, here we go. So far as ruling and being ruled are concerned, each of the parts in him minds its own business. That and nothing else is the cause. Are you still looking for justice to be something different from this power, which produces such men in cities? No, by Zeus, I'm not. Then that dream of ours has reached its perfect fulfillment. I mean, our saying that we suspected that straight from the beginning of the city's founding, through some god, we probably hit upon an origin and model for justice. That's entirely certain. What was that principle? Thus, Glaucon, it was after all a kind of phantom of justice. That's also why it is so helpful. It's being right for the man who is by nature a shoemaker to practice shoemaking and do nothing else, and for the carpenter to practice carpentry, and so on for the rest. It looks like it. And in truth, justice was, as it seems, something of this sort. However, not with respect to a man's minding his external business, but with respect to what is within. With respect to what truly concerns him in his own. He doesn't let each part in him mind other people's business or the three classes in the soul meddle with each other, but really sets his own house in good order and rules himself. He arranges himself, becomes his own friend, and harmonizes the three parts exactly like three notes in a harmonic scale, lowest, highest, and middle. And if there are some other parts in between, he binds them together and becomes entirely one for many, moderate and harmonized. Then and only then he acts, if he does act in some way, either concerning the acquisition of money, or the care of the body, or something political, or concerning private contracts. In all of these actions, he believes and names a just and fine action, one that preserves and helps to produce this condition, and wisdom the knowledge that supervises this action, while he believes and names an unjust action, one that undoes this condition, lack of learning, and in its turn the opinion that supervises this action. Socrates, what you say is entirely true. So we have identified justice. Its positive form that when properly ordered in the soul prevents all those vices and injustices. We must start to understand justice as a positive quality of self-friendship, where each part is in order with respect to the whole. But this requires a profound understanding and reason that thinks about the good of the whole and then puts it into an impact through the speeches in the spirited part. And the desires properly harmonized. Notice this is not the elimination of desire. We are not Stoics. We absolutely have desire and we indulge it at the right times. But we do not go so far as to allow it to take control of us. And we do not allow our spirited part to become angry and out of control and overcome reason. And we do not allow reason to eliminate the other parts, which is what you find in the Stoics and certain forms of religion, right? Nope. Each thing does its thing. We are not in the interest of eliminating our humanity. We are in the interest of ordering it toward the good. Okay? Total rejection of the Jedi from Star Wars. Every human faculty has a proper end. We're not eliminating some and pursuing others. Proper order of the whole human system, for which we are thankful that God gave us. Everyone understand what we're talking about, what justice is. All right. Turn the page. Phase 4. Solving the myth. All right, so shall we say we have asserted justice? Next page 448. By Zeus, no indeed. Shall we assert it then? Let's assert it. so be it. After that, I suppose, injustice must be considered, plainly. Mustn't it in its turn be a certain faction among those three, a meddling, an interference, and a rebellion of a part of the soul against the whole? The purpose of the rebellious part is to rule in the soul, although this is not proper, since by nature it is fit to be a slave to that which belongs to the ruling class. Something of this sort, I suppose, will say that the confusion and wandering of these parts are, okay, ready? Here we go. All four of the key vices for Plato. Ready? Are injustice, opposite of justice, licentiousness, opposite of moderation, cowardice, opposite of, and ignorance or lack of learning, opposite of wisdom. In sum, vice entire. You're the first class I've had that actually knew what licentiousness was, ever. This is because you're Catholics. Some of you are starting Catholics, okay? Nobody knows the moral language anymore out in the world. Back in the day, your readers, you remember the little, 4th, 5th grade reader? They were filled with moral language. Now, through our relativistic culture, nobody knows anything. It's a major problem. We need to understand moral language if we're going to apply those moral concepts. Certainly, that is what they are. Then I said, as for performing unjust actions and being unjust, and again, doing just things, is it what all of them are by now clearly manifest? If injustice and justice are also manifest? How so? Because, I said, they don't differ from the healthy and the sick. What these are in a body, they are in a soul. And all right, at this point, Socrates suddenly introduces an entirely new analogy. You're like, what? Is this going to take up 3 more books? No. Maybe 3 or 4 lines. Okay? You're like, what is going on here? Well, the body and the soul have a parallelism, apparently. Body, soul. All right, let's see what he's going to argue. This is amazing. All right, to produce health is to establish the parts of the body in a relation of mastering and being mastered by one another, that is according to nature. While to produce sickness is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another, that is contrary to nature. So the body pursues as its goal health. And how is this achieved? An ordering according to what? Correct, nature. Okay? So far, so good. Then, in its turn, I said, isn't to produce justice to establish the parts of the soul in a relation of mastering and being mastered by one another, that is, according to nature, while to produce injustice is to establish a relation of ruling and being ruled by one another, that is contrary to nature. The health of the soul is this order, just like the body. Virtue, then, as it seems, would be a certain health, beauty, and good condition of a soul. Vice, a sickness, ugliness, weakness. Why is virtue the health of the soul versus the sickness is vice? Why? Well, what have we just been studying? The proper order of the soul. There's 3 parts, and when each part is doing its proper function, that's the ordering, and that is called what?
Virtue of justice.
Virtue of justice, virtue of moderation, right? Virtue. Here's the point. The soul has every bit as much as a real structure as does the body. You screw it up, you have an unhealthy soul. And notice, it is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of what? Look, I could come in here today, and I could have had my arm dangling off by a mere thread of flesh and blood squirting out. I'd be like, all right, let's get started with class. I'd be like, oh, Jeff, Dr. Steele, this is not good. What's the problem? Like, your arm's hanging off. We got to get you to the hospital. I'd be like, how dare you? imposing your health values on me. To me, health is to have my arm with a beautiful red haze all around me. I can't believe you're haters. Terrible, evil people judging me. And you're like, looking at my watch before he loses consciousness, right? Why? Is health a mere matter of opinion? Does health change because I want it to be something else? No, it doesn't. Question, why do we think any different about the soul? Since the soul also has a structure every bit as real as the body that we just identified, since the soul also has an ordering that makes it function properly, named the virtues, how could we possibly think that the vices could ever make us happy? What is the health of the soul? Happiness. And it is not according to opinion. It is according to nature. If I have the wrong opinion about whether my arm hanging off is going to help me, my opinion is going to do me in. It doesn't suddenly become fine because I want to believe it. The want to believe movement is out of their minds. Right? Truth is not what you believe in. Sorry, Rachel Platten. Not the best song. But this is all our media ever preaches us, screams at us with rage. But it's not real. If you live in certain ways, you are going to massively degrade yourself. And you will never be happy. Why? Because the only possible way to be happy is to have a healthy soul. And the only way to have a healthy soul is virtue. And what's really shocking is in a world today where they make everything relative, somehow we still have a mental health profession who goes around acting like this is not merely a matter of opinion. Well, if it's not a matter of opinion, then it must be according to what? Now, granted, they're sliding increasingly to the scale of, what do you want? And then the mental health profession simply helps you get there. Means to an end, so much for health. It's not mental health, right? It's mental engineering. But in point of fact, we still have disorders that are recognized in books that are according to nature, which means there is a structure to the soul.
So I remember RCIA. If you have a healthy soul, but you just by the vicissitudes of fate have a terrible life, how would you judge the health of your soul if you're, doing a pretty good job of being virtuous in horrible conditions and you're not happy?
Well, we'd have to, that's the question. Let's move on. Good question. All right. Don't find practices also conduce to the acquisition of virtue and base one's device necessarily. Phase 4. Now watch it. We're going to hit the answer to the myth, knock it out of the park, and it's almost go by you. It's going to hit so fast. So as it seems, top of the next page, 444E, 445A, it now remains for us to consider whether it is profitable to do just things, practice fine ones, and be just, whether or not one's being such remains unnoticed, or whether it is profitable to do injustice and be unjust, provided one doesn't pay the penalty and become better as a result of punishment. There's the challenge of the myth, right? Mm-hmm. But Socrates, he said, that inquiry looks to me as though it has become ridiculous by now. If life doesn't seem livable with the body's nature corrupted, not even with every sort of food and drink and every sort of wealth and every sort of rule, will it then be livable when the nature of that very thing by which we live is confused and corrupted? Even if a man does whatever else he might want, except that which will rid him of vice and injustice and will enable him to acquire justice and virtue? Isn't this clear now that all of these qualities have manifested their characters in our description? Yes, it is ridiculous. And apparently that's it. Game over. So, what's the answer? What's the solution to the challenge of the myth?
Don't make your soul unhealthy.
Don't make your soul unhealthy. But why not pursue everything you want?
It's not according to your nature to do that.
Because your nature consists of how many parts? 3. How many of those parts is desire? 1. So if you satisfy only your wants, what are you doing? You're satisfying one part of the soul. But happiness is the good of what? the whole. Thus, it was never possible for people who pursue pleasure, follow the doctrine of hedonism, to ever think that they could ever have been happy. And here's the thing, they're not. They are routinely bored and trying to find a new thrill. Even the drug addicts, right, that really go all out, get into meth and heroin, even while they're on their drugs, they'll admit they're not actually happy. They're miserable. You say you can be high and miserable at the same time? Oh yeah. You can be having fantastic pleasures and hate what you're doing at the same time. See, with my pagan students nowadays, I got to use pretty tough examples. So I use these examples of the people. Apparently there's some in Ohio. I mean, I'm not from Ohio, I wouldn't know myself, but that like to have sex with sheep. And I have to think the person having sex with the sheep is having a really good time, but on the other hand, there must be some deep sense that this is not good. You can be having pleasure, but no, not good. Now, I wouldn't use that with you guys because you're good Catholics and probably don't have a thing for sheep, right? But I'm just bringing this up as an example of the kind of people we're dealing with out in the world, right? And you use examples like this, they look at you like, oh yeah, that would be pleasant maybe, sort of, with certain farmer types, but not good. Right. Pleasure does not entail goodness. Serial killers were constantly trotted out as a counterexample to the idea that justice is the key to happiness. Really, look at their eyes. Look at their eyes. They're dead. Adolf Eichmann, right? If anyone should have been happy doing what he wanted to get rid of all the Jews in Europe. Remember, Nazi? He got rid of all but 5,000 Jews in Poland. Pretty good. You'd have to give him almost an A+ for success. And yet, when the Jews found him, remember the special Mossad team grabbed him? Was he happy? Thrilled with his success? No. Did you see the pictures of him on the stand in Israel? Or not the stand, the box, I guess, right? Just dead. Vice does not make people happy. Getting what you want does not make you happy, right? And if you think it's going to satisfy you, next thing you know, look, when you were 5 years old, you had all the evidence you knew that this doctrine is nuts. Say, how did we know? Okay, you make your Christmas list, you sign it in a form, you send it to Santa. I want these 6 things. Christmas time comes, there they are. Voila! Everything that I wanted, my dreams have come true. I'm so happy. Question, how long do those gifts make you happy? 10 minutes. Right? And then you're on next year's Christmas list.
Birthday.
Right? Birthday list. Now, we of course view ourselves as much more sophisticated, right? What do we want? Well, if I can just get a new house, a new job, a new car, better restaurants, new spouse, right? Then I'll be happy. Better boat, better vacation. We're just doing the same thing. Now, there's nothing wrong with wanting better things. I don't want you to misunderstand me. But if it's in a hedonistic system, it won't work. It has to be part of an overall balance, right? That's the virtue of moderation. Desire is good. God gave us desire to be fulfilled as part of the whole. But if we turn desire into a god, right, where it dictates everything, and we start committing injustices to people to get what we want, this will not work. It will not make us happy. And the proof is right there in front of us when we were kids. And so we have people just spinning their wheels, going from one set of desires to the next one, and the proof has been there the whole time. It does not work. Americans are not happy. Not happy in spite of this massive production system we have. Unbelievable wealth. Every possible desire is satiated. Still angry, upset, stressed. It'd be far better if we had way less and learned the virtue of moderation, which is kind of what Socrates was suggesting at the beginning with the warning about the feverish city, wasn't he? So, want fulfillment will not satisfy you because want fulfillment only satisfies one part of the soul, and happiness is the good of the whole. And that is the fundamental criticism of hedonism. And by the way, it's also the fundamental criticism of Stoicism in the other way, because the Stoics reduced the whole human self to reason. And you can find this in certain Catholic circles where an over-spiritualism, if I'm just more spiritual, I'll be able to solve this problem. If I just pray more, well, good luck. It isn't going to work. Why? Because you're not a pure spirit. I'm using spirit now, not in that spirit way up here I had before. Okay? You are a mind-body composite. You are a human being with the soul informing the body. You've got to pay attention to the whole thing. You can never leave your incarnate self. Jesus is incarnate. It's always the whole thing. You've got to take into account the body. And that body will impact you. for good, but also for ill in the ways that you're concerned with. And that all of us have experienced in our lives. We've experienced these things in your family, in your friends, in your own self, these limitations. And then you have to use reason to reorder what you're going to do and realize my life is not over because this happened to me. Many people just give up. We don't give up. Why? Because question, what is the fundamental goal of life? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. What's the second greatest goal? To love your neighbor as yourself. Can you do that if you get cancer? You're not out of the fight until you're dead. Having cancer is not dead. You'll get dead. We're all going to get dead. So don't worry about death. Worry about love. No matter what the enemy throws at you, you can persevere through the virtue of courage, and you can keep loving God and loving your neighbor. And that is the mission. That's what you've got to hold on to. That is the true good that reason gives us when we have the faith. So don't allow situations in your life to dishearten you. Hold firmly to what is true, good, and noble opinion, and let the virtue of courage move you on toward that good. Now, I'm reminded of something because, of course, we're concerned about the question of torture. If you're on the rack in this condition, are you happy? And I'm remembering the story of William Wallace in that great movie, Braveheart. Remember this? Have you all seen this film? My current students, the freshmen, they've not seen this. I'm so glad I'm teaching people that are a bit older.
Classic.
I know. They don't watch classics. But anyway, so here's our hero the night before bad things are going to happen, right? And remember the princess comes into the prison? And what does she bring with her? Drugs. Why don't you take this drug? He's like, no way. Now, if you were going to be tortured to death tomorrow, right? You might, I think morphine would be helpful. How much you got? I got a pile of hay. I'll trade for that, right? He doesn't. Why doesn't he want him? Right? What happens tomorrow if he's high as a kite and the king says, "Here, kiss my ring"? Oh yeah, I'll kiss anything. Oh yeah, definitely. Well, there goes the whole rebellion, right? Remember they tried this with Jesus. Remember they put the stuff on the thing and gave it to him, and he's like, spits it out. Can you imagine how different our religion would be if Jesus took it as high as a kite in the cross? Oh yeah, babe, you know, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, and neither do I, right? Different religion, I don't think it would have worked. There are times when it's okay to take meds. Many times. But there are other times where the good of the situation requires you to say, I can't do that. You say, well, this is going to hurt. That's right. Pain is not the worst thing in the world. According to the hedonist, if pleasure is the good, it follows pain must be evil. But pleasure is not the good. Pain is unhelpful. Pain is not wanted. But you can endure pain. Wallace knew he could endure pain. He had spent his entire life training what part of his soul? Well, I lost my spirited part. The spirited part. Right? He was a warrior, a soldier. He had inured himself through discipline in battle. And he knew he could endure it. Was it going to hurt? Oh, yes. Did he want this to happen? Oh, no. Did it matter what his desires wanted? No. So the next day, there he goes. He goes up there and they say, look, kiss the ring of the king and we'll just chop off your head and be done with it. Sounds great, right? Nope. So they're, all right. And I think they racked him first, right? Stretch. All your joints being ripped out. That's got to hurt. Yeah. And he's like, I'm not kissing the ring. So then they moved on. Step 2, hanging him. You know, that's got to really hurt too. But he refuses to give in. Now think what's happening in his soul. His desiring parts are probably moving toward the suggestion of a rebellion. Right? We think we should take over. We've noticed there's quite a lot of agony here. And we think that reason does not know what it is doing. And they come around to get to the palace and they can't believe what's in front of them. A Spartan phalanx standing right there. And the producers are like, oh, maybe we'll wait. Right? And then the hanging starts. And the desires are like, maybe we can just waltz right by these guardians, right? So they get closer and the guardians form up. The shiny shields, bright helmets, spear points. And they stop again. Then they take Wallace and they throw him down in that, not an altar, what is it called? The desk, the table, right? And then they start rip open his guts and start peeling out all of his intestines and they're going all over the place. Boy, that's really gotta hurt. And the thing is, you know you're done. You know there's no coming back from this. And at this point, what are his desires doing? They are screaming bloody murder, right? But he has ordered his soul according to reason. He has formed a courageous part. He has the order of moderation. And at that point, what does the commander of the phalanx do? Spartans advance. And they are going to cut down every desire that gets in their way. That is a soul that is well ordered. And here's the key for Socrates. The soul is well ordered, which means it is what? Happy soul. Happiness is not defined as the absence of pain. Happiness is defined as the properly ordered soul. What that means in different situations is going to vary. And that's because he holds the line. That's why at the end of that, I don't know how many of you saw this in the theater. I saw this in the theater. We're all like, on the edge of our seat. And then he cries out, freedom. Freedom! And everyone in the theater's like, right? And here's the thing, you're like, no, it wasn't just me. And here's the thing.
It's a classic movie.
There's not a single person who would want to be in that situation. None of you. And yet you admire Wallace. We admire him. And admiration means you hope that in that situation you would do the same thing. Nathan Hale, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. Socrates put his money where his mouth was too. Because the democratic Athens put him down, they killed him, and he didn't give up philosophy. Jesus Christ, what about all of our saints? How many of them were martyred for the faith? What are you going to do, just throw in the towel? Look, here's the thing. You're all going to die. There's no escape. The only question is, are you going to die for nothing, or are you going to die for something? So if push comes to shove and you're put to that thing, you might as well have already made your choice. You might as well have spent a life devoted to truth and justice and goodness, developing the virtues in your life. So it really isn't a question. You know what you're going to do. I'm just going to keep walking right into heaven if that's what it takes. Bring it on. Let's get this on. That's why we admire these people. And that means even in these situations, we can have a well-ordered soul. So, is there any chance of being happy without justice? No? If you have an invisibility ring and you can get everything you ever wanted and nobody will ever find out, is that going to make you happy? No? So, what should be the singular focus of our life according to Socrates?
Virtue.
To pursue virtue. Pursue virtue. And now we'll Catholicize this, take this up a notch. What is virtue ultimately for? It's not just to make us happy. It's not just to make us good. It's not just to make us whole.
The glory of God.
It is to fit us for beholding the glory of God, to make us fit lovers for God. That's the mission. Virtue is ultimately a good in itself and a means to an end. So, only the pure in heart see God. And this is the means to that purity. Everyone understand the argument? All right, we're out of time. So, for next week. We're going to skip books 5 through 7, because at next page, Glaucon and Adeimantus say, can we talk about that wives in common thing? And they spend 3 books debating that. Then, we come to book 8. And in book 8, we're going to start looking at the regimes that go bad, just like the souls that go bad. We've talked about the virtuous soul. What about the bad ones? Okay? And I want you, and there's going to be 5 regimes. Obviously, the first one, aristocracy, that's what we've been talking about. The next regime, Socrates calls it that Laconian regime. That's timocracy, society devoted to honor. Next is oligarchy, society devoted to wealth. Next is democracy, society devoted to equality. And finally, tyranny, society devoted to power. Okay? I'd like you to read all of that section in book 8. All right? But I want you to focus specifically, because we're going to talk specifically about democracy, because it's a complete prediction of our current situation. You're not going to believe what Socrates knows. Okay? So that's going to start around 543a and go to 562a. Okay? 543a to 562a. I will send that to you, because obviously you don't have pens necessarily. So read all of book 8, okay, if you can, but specifically focus in detail on those lines. And we will talk about democratic society, how it's formed in the soul, how it's formed in the regime, and the disaster this leads to. You're just not going to believe it. All right, everybody good?
All three of these sound like failure modes in terms of the regimes.
Well, we're going to see they're getting increasingly worse. Aristocracy is ruled by the wise, hence the rulers. Democracy is ruled by the guardian auxiliaries, next level down. Oligarchy is ruled by the producing classes who produce the things. Democracy, we now split the producers into two halves, those who make and those who consume. In the democracy, ruled by the consumer. And then, of course, tyranny, you become totally ripe for control, ruled by the one. So democracy for Socrates is the last regime that moves you this close to being tyrannical. How? Why? Well, we have to wait and see. You see why democratic Athens killed him, huh? All right. See you next week.